I think we'll get started with the second session of the plenary component to the Iowa Swine Day this morning. I want to just, if any of you have watched the news lately, one of the things that you'll see in the news is that there are certain airlines, many of them are having struggles to make connections. It's kind of a perfect storm situation. In fact, I was in a United flight coming from Montana on Monday. We were supposed to be home in the 11 o'clock hour, and I got home at 4 a.m. last Monday. And I felt a little guilty at 12:30 a.m. getting on the plane because the terminal was filled with passengers that weren't going to leave. And so it really is a situation right now with the airlines, and that's actually what caught our next speaker, who was anticipating and planning and looking forward to joining us in person. But the airline situation prevented Banks Baker from being able to join us in person. So we're fortunate for the technology that was able in the last 12 hours to pull things around and have Banks join us virtually. So it's a pleasure to introduce Banks Baker. He's the Global Director of Product Sustainability for PIC, a global animal genetics and biotechnology company. He supports genetic improvement and gene editing as a way to continually improve animal agriculture and provide holistic benefits across the value chain, including reduced greenhouse gas emissions, improved animal welfare, and more efficient protein production. Previously, Banks led a protein sustainability initiative or group for McDonald's USA, creating and implementing greenhouse gas reduction strategies and managing animal health and welfare commitments and antibiotic policies. Prior to that, he had established a regenerative agriculture research department for a private operating nonprofit foundation and managed farms and ranches across the United States. Banks has an undergraduate business degree from Warren Wilson College and holds 2 master's degrees, one in agriculture and one in business from Colorado State University and the University of Notre Dame, respectively. Banks lives in Livingston, Montana with his wife Shelby and their dog Hoover. It's a pleasure to have you here today, Banks, talking about genetic improvements in a sustainable food system.
Great. Well, thank you for the introduction. Can you guys all hear me all right? All right. I'm assuming you all can hear me all right.
I can hear you.
Great. Yeah. Again, apologies for the inconvenience of not being able to be there. My 7 a.m. flight was canceled, and then my rebooked flight was pushed back to the point where I wasn't able to make my connecting into Des Moines. And so I was really looking forward to this particular meeting. And so I apologize I can't be there with you in person, and hope to get the opportunity to speak at this event again and to get to meet many of you in person at a different date. But I'm really looking forward to being able to share some of the things that we're doing at PIC and really some of the changes that are happening in our food system. And so I appreciated that introduction. My name is Banks Baker. I'm the Global Director of Product Sustainability for PIC. My primary role, my primary responsibility is around gaining and earning market acceptance for our PRRS-resistant pig. We have a genetically edited pig that we are working through regulation approval around the world that is completely resilient to all strains that we've tested of the PRRS virus. And so a lot of what we're going to talk today is just around how genetic improvements, including those achieved through gene editing, support some of the pressures and some of the progress that we need to make as animal agriculture. As my introduction highlighted, I have spent a lot of time trying to understand and be a student of agriculture throughout most of my adult life and career. And so I have managed and worked on farms and ranches. I've studied regenerative agriculture. And then I've also worked at major corporations, and I did lead protein sustainability for McDonald's and trying to address a lot of the pressures that exist there. And so we as agriculture, we are being asked a lot. There are a lot of things that agriculture is being asked to do, and we're being asked to do them all at the same time. We're asking for continual improvement in animal health and welfare. We're asking for a reduced need for treatment of antibiotics. We're doing this in the face of food affordability and availability challenges with inflation and the war in Iraq and the war in Ukraine. And then also, on top of all of this, we're asking all of these things to be accomplished while we're also reducing the climate and the carbon footprint of production. And so how do we achieve all of these things all at the same time? And I believe that we need to utilize technology to get there, and that we can get there, and we can do it while we're making our systems more efficient and we're making our businesses more profitable. And so something I want to do is just kind of set a backdrop. I think those of us that are involved in agriculture and animal agriculture specifically, I don't think we always understand the corporate and government climate pressures. We see a lot of the negative news media or some consumer sentiment about agriculture, specifically animal agriculture, and we don't always understand some of the things that are going on underneath that. And so I did want to just start off our presentation by talking about those pressures. And at my last role at McDonald's, this was something that became extremely clear to us, was that not only did we need to make changes to our food, to our sourcing decisions, but we also had to be a part of that change. And it was being driven by consumers, it was being driven by stakeholders, and it was being driven by government. And so I just wanted to take a moment to really set the stage for what that landscape looks like right now in the United States and really across the globe. And so this is a pretty interesting statistic here. Some of you may have heard of the Science-Based Target Initiative. They're also referred to kind of colloquially as SBTI. They are an organization that corporations make their greenhouse gas reduction and climate commitments to and through. And essentially what they do is they align your supply chain with the Climate Paris Accord, and so that you're making reductions that keep global warming at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And since SBTI was launched, we've seen an unprecedented amount of companies that have committed to these targets. When I used to give this presentation, this number was 1,200 just a year and a half ago. And so now I've had to update this. More than 5,200 companies across 50 sectors are now working with SBTI to set climate targets. And the important thing there is this isn't just agriculture. This is not just food. These are all sectors that are working with SBTI to set these type of commitments. And so companies that have made these commitments through SBTI, they now represent over a third of global market capitalization, worth $38 trillion. And I'm going to say that number just one more time. Over a third of the global market capitalization worth $38 trillion. I don't think that we really talk about this enough, but that is a significant number, and that's a lot of companies that are making these commitments and then trying to figure out how to achieve them. Some major companies there below that do impact pork and pork volumes and pork pricing and pork attributes when they make purchasing decisions are, of course, McDonald's, as we've talked about, Target, Cargill, Target, Tyson, and then JBS. And as big as these numbers are and as striking as they are, they don't even encompass all of the other companies that are making similar type commitments. And so we've also seen major corporations like Walmart that have also made science-based greenhouse gas reduction goals. They're just not through that specific SBTI namesake and brand. And so we're seeing an unprecedented amount of companies that are making commitments that have protein in their supply chain. If you aren't setting these climate targets, this is an interesting one. Costco is a very interesting example. I am a diehard Costco fan. I shop there as often as I can. I'm a loyal member, and I think very highly of the company and its leadership. Costco received a shareholder proposal that asked them to set a climate target, and that was reviewed by their board and by their leadership. And Costco made the recommendation at their shareholders meeting that there would be a no vote. However, that's not the way that it went. Their shareholders actually voted in favor of Costco setting a climate target that was rooted in science. And so now companies are being compelled to set these climate targets. And so now Costco is trying to figure out what that means for them. And support for shareholder proposals on GHG emissions, they rose to an average of 59% last year. Now this is a 2022 number compared with 25% in 2017. That's a significant increase. We're seeing a lot more pressure, not just from consumers, but actually from the people that own the company and as shareholders, and then also institutional investors. And so we've gotten to the point now why by the end of last year, in December of 2022, 83% of Fortune 500 companies now have climate-related targets. And I think as this Costco example highlights, we're very likely to see that number jump significantly. But it's not just corporations that are setting these type of commitments. The governments around the world are taking action. And I'll use here the US government commitments and policies. The Biden administration has committed the US government to become net zero by 2050. And then some of you may have even seen that the Securities and Exchange Commission may be requiring all publicly traded companies, regardless of size, to start disclosing their greenhouse gas emissions. And so when you look at this from a logical deduction standpoint, and you see governments making commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then actually using the Securities and Exchange Commission to require and compel the reporting of what those emissions are, some of us start looking at this from a logical deduction standpoint and start wondering, what comes next? Are there going to be certain types of policies? Are there going to be certain types of instruments that are going to force reductions across all sections of business? And up until at the end of last year, we had to theorize, but we don't have to look too far anymore. The European Union announced at the end of last year, you can see here the European Union, again, these are from the Wall Street Journal. You can look these up and get some additional deep dive information from these articles from WSJ. Europe strikes deal to tax imports based on greenhouse gas emissions. So what does this mean? By the end of 2023, in order to sell certain commodities into the European Union, and those commodities are concrete, steel, aluminum, fertilizer, and then some energy, you're going to have to report your greenhouse gas emissions associated with those commodities by the end of 2023. And then at a later date, you're actually going to have to pay a carbon tax on top of what those emissions are compared to domestic production. And so this is no longer a theory. This is no longer something that might happen. This is becoming real, and it is happening. Also, in April of 26 and 2023, we saw that the Securities Exchange Commission climate rules could decide whether U.S. firms face tough EU laws. And so right now we're trying to figure out in the United States, are we able to make our SEC reporting requirements robust enough so that if we want to do business and if we need to do business in the European Union, can they be in alignment? And so we don't have two different reporting standards. We don't have two different tax standards in order to deal with in a global landscape. And so this is very much a movement in process. We're seeing policy being created. We're seeing it being implemented, and it's not going away. And we've seen the U.S. protein industry really respond in a pretty drastic way, and it's honestly pretty impressive. This came shortly after we've seen many corporations make their commitments, and you can see here the major protein industries have followed. U.S. pork has set a goal to reduce GHG emissions by 40% by 2030. The U.S. beef industries set a goal to be carbon neutral by 2040. And then U.S. dairy are trying to achieve GHG neutrality by 2050, 10 years after beef. And so, we're really starting to see just a significant movement. And as we look at this, what does this mean, right? And so as agriculture producers, as agriculture and as food companies, like what does this mean and how do we achieve that? This is a really interesting article that came out from the Star Tribune out of Minnesota after the pork industry commitment to reduce emissions by 40%. And you can see here, pork producers have options to reduce emissions. And you can see here the tops are cover crops, no-till farming, and solar panels. And although these are extremely important strategies and practices that are going to help meet corporations, governments, and industry meet these goals, they're also very difficult to implement. They're difficult to monitor, they're difficult to report, and they're difficult to verify. Now, what if I'm a pork producer that doesn't own my cropping ground? Can I really introduce cover crops or compel others to do so? Same with no-till farming. What if I'm in an area that doesn't have solar panel sunlight regulation, or I'm not able to actually access that market? And so something that we're doing and that we're working with others in the industry to do is to make sure that we understand, what about the role of genetic improvements? Why has that not been included here? And this isn't unique. We can look at these graphs across all of these different commitments, across dairy, across beef, and genetics have historically not been represented. What about the role of genetic improvements? We know that that's one of the most important things that a farmer can do to improve the sustainability of his business outside of management, or choose animals that already have a higher propensity for efficient production, animals that are efficient, that are robust, that are healthy. This needs to be a part of the solution. And this is something that we're working to make sure we can demonstrate, and that we can then influence the next time these type of charts are going out around the world for how pork producers can improve emissions. Genetics is included in that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the role of genetic improvements in a sustainable food system. So in order for us to make sure that we can value genetic improvements and value genetic innovation, is we need to understand, what is the impact? What is that environmental impact? And so PIC, independent of anybody else, we've gone under the process, and we're working through a life cycle assessment. And a life cycle assessment is also known as a life cycle analysis or cradle to grave analysis. It's a standardized and scientific method of assessing environmental impacts associated with all stages of a product's life. And our goal within our LCA at PIC is to credibly and defensively model the environmental impacts of genetic improvements, including those achieved through gene editing, to better understand and share that opportunity across, up and down the value and production chain. And so what we're doing to understand our environmental impact and what our elite genetics and what our gene edit will deliver to the global pork production world is we're modeling that out through these LCAs, and we're doing that in 4 specific regions. We're doing that in North America as a composite with both US, Canada, and Mexico. We're also going to be doing these in Asia with Japan and China. And then we're also having an independent LCA of European Union countries, inclusive of the UK. We've also started to align with the International Organization of Standardization, ISO. We understand that in order for us to influence what counts and what doesn't count in the global landscape as these standards are becoming implemented and created, is that we need to make sure what we're talking about is defensible. We need to make sure that it's credible, so that we as agriculture can go out there and influence the regulations that we're going to have to abide by. Because I can tell you right now, that's not what's always happening. We're seeing other industries like logistics or airlines or other things that are strictly just fossil fuel input based being applied to agriculture. And we know that there is a difference between agriculture and those industries. And we need to make sure that we're influencing that now, so that we are offensive and not defensive in trying to change things after they've already been codified and implemented. And so our alignment with the international ISO standard and our LCA going through that process is certainly going to help that. And so that gives us one thing. That gives us the ability to have an impact factor. We'll understand how much our genetics are influencing environmental factors. But that doesn't allow us the ability yet to understand how a corporation can claim that as a GHG reduction. And so last year, we did enter into a partnership that we're very grateful for with the U.S. National Pork Board, so that we can then create a framework to demonstrate how genetic improvements support sustainable pork production, and then bolster those corporate climate and federal goals that we talked about today. Genetics have never been utilized in this way, and so we feel it's extremely important that we are influencing that and allowing them to be a part of the conversation. We're establishing a standardized process. Because these have never been used before, there's not a process for it. And so part of this framework that we're doing with the National Pork Board is that we're going to be outlining all of the things that have to exist for a corporation to claim the demonstrated use of elite genetics like PICs, or a innovative technology like the PRRS gene edit, so that they can then use that as part of their strategy to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And a really important part of this is that this is a really big piece of work. And PIC, we're investing a lot of resources, both human and financial, to make sure that this is done effectively and accurately. But we're not doing it just for the benefit of us. We understand that genetic improvements are an extremely important are going to play an extremely important role in allowing everybody to meet these climate goals. And so we're investing in this, and we're working alongside the industry, like the U.S. Pork Board, so that that framework, once it's complete and codified, it can be utilized by any genetics company as long as they meet the minimum framework criteria that was outlined as credible. And so we are creating that standard right now. We talked about a lot of things. I just wanted to have one slide where we kind of ran through how all of these things fit together, and some of the things that that we're trying to achieve. So we talked about quantifying GHG reductions. That's an independent exercise that PIC is funding and running independently of anyone else. That gives us our specific amount of environmental impact that our products deliver. We're defining and creating a pathway for corporations and others to be able to claim the reductions associated with the use of genetic innovation and improvements. That's the partnership that we just talked about with the National Pork Board. And then this next piece is we're actually going to take our quantification, our LCA data, we're going to take the framework that we've created with Pork Board, and then we're going to pilot it. We're going to pilot it with major brands. We're going to pilot it with the input from environmental NGOs, carbon experts, government agencies, and others to make sure that we're doing it appropriately and in a recognizable way. And we're going to demonstrate that this is a standard. And then we believe that once we do that, it will influence the way that genetics are interpreted and looked around the world. And so once we do that, we are also going to be replicating this same process globally. You saw our LCA regions. We're starting in North America, and so we'll have our first pilot in the United States. But after that is our intention to replicate this in Asia, in Europe, in Canada, in Mexico. And once we do that, we believe that we will be creating and influencing a standard for how genetic innovations and improvements will be valued. So how do pork producers benefit in all of this? Genetic improvements make farms more efficient and profitable. And this is a really important one. And I get to interact with producers, and it's one of my favorite parts of my jobs, really all over the country and now all over the world. And sometimes the feedback I get is, hey, Banks, I don't believe in climate change, or I don't believe humans are causing it. And, I'm here to tell you today that, really that doesn't matter. I think I've already made an extremely compelling case that our customers and our customers' customers have goals and they need to achieve them, and they're asking for this. We're also seeing these federal regulations that are going to likely require business to achieve these goals. But outside of just those pressures in the stick, there's also a very strong carrot. Genetic improvements make farms more efficient and profitable. And just being even more general, removing carbon from production systems, by being carbon efficient, by making your farm, your business more carbon efficient, you're making it more profitable. You are literally meeting the definition of true sustainability by doing more with less. That also has positive profitability implications. And now with emerging technologies like gene editing, we can enable significant improvements in health and further accelerate all these benefits that we've talked about briefly here today. So now using PIC Elate Genetics allows pork producers to mitigate carbon emissions. That's another important piece. We're not sequestering carbon after it's already happened. If we use a more efficient animal, we are stopping those emissions from being emitted in the first place. It's much easier to fix it. It's much easier to mitigate emission than to try to sequester it later. Just like trying to keep an animal healthier than trying to get them healthy after that's already occurred. And so these opportunities that producers have, and once you can demonstrate that you are more efficient, we believe that may be able to create other opportunities of economic value that you'll be able to tap into, like preferred packer contracts, access to carbon markets, labeling premiums, and there's some others. But again, this is a really early space, and we're still trying to figure out, how the market values these improvements and, how the value chain is going to respond. So now we're going to talk about the role of gene editing in genetic improvements, and I'm realizing I need to move probably pretty fast here. Gene editing is making the headlines, and you've likely seen a lot of these over the course of the last 6 months to a year. We are starting to see human health applications, and it is pretty compelling. Gene editing and gene editing therapies in human health are starting to really make the headlines and make a change. We're starting to see these potentially solve or cure or treat HIV, sickle cell anemia, certain types of cancer. There's even some applications where they're working on to try to solve for COVID. And so we see this as the consumer starts seeing this, we start understanding that these advancements are significant and they need to be applied to animal health as well. And we have seen some applications in animal health. You may have seen there was an FDA approval for just 3 breeding animals where they actually were able to gene edit some cattle that could express a slick coat. And so that slick coat allowed those animals to be raised in a warming environment. There was also a recent announcement where they're going to be potentially genetically modifying hens so that only female chicks would be laid, and so that you wouldn't have the wasted resources of incubating male chicks or the issues of having to emasculate them because they're not commercially viable. And we are really lucky that we get to be talking about this PRRS edit, and pork gets to be the first one here. We talked about some of those other examples, but they're really smaller scale and they haven't been implemented at commercial scale yet. And we believe that the PRRS edit is going to be the first one to be able to do that, not just in pork, but across all animal and protein species. And so I wanted to share with you this stat, and I think it's pretty striking, is currently there are 3,600, over 3,600 gene editing therapies being developed for human medicine, and 49% of those are targeting cancer. And so we're already seeing this make a significant and monstrous impact on human health. But in agriculture, we've already seen more than 500 products that are being developed globally, mostly in crops, some in animals. And I believe that when we look down the line here in the near future, that we're going to see gene editing be ubiquitous, both in the human application and in the animal and plant side in agriculture. And again, I think that we're just extremely lucky that we get to be the first ones to introduce this as pork and be leaders. We'll talk a little bit about continuous improvement with genetic innovations. PIC, we have a 60-year legacy of providing genetic improvements in pigs, and we've done that for 60 years. We've made pigs healthier, we made them robust, we've made them more efficient. But now gene editing allows us to do that even faster, and it allows us to help pigs live better, healthier lives. And so without going into too much detail, I wanted to share a little bit about our PRRS-resistant pig. And so PIC did partner with researchers at the University of Missouri to identify a solution to PRRS. And PIC, we use gene editing technology to remove a binding site of the target protein. That target protein is CD163. And once that CD163 part is partially edited, that is the binding site for the PRRS virus. So after that, the PRRS virus can no longer bind to that gene edited protein, and it makes the pig resistant to the disease. Now, I think everybody's always heard of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms, but I'm not so sure everybody always understands what's the difference between gene editing and GMO. And so in gene editing, and so for the instance that we just talked about with our PRRS edit, a protein is deleted from an organism's own DNA to modify its genetic code. And so no foreign DNA is inserted. We're just specifically removing a very small, specific section of that material. Where in genetically modified organisms, DNA from another outside organism is introduced to modify that genetic code. And so that's really an important thing for us to understand. One is a slight edit where there's a little bit of a removal. One is the actual introduction of genetic material from an outside organism. So how do we talk about the benefits that we're creating here? We know that genetic improvements are important. They have been for the last 60 years. Now, how do we talk about that on top of our genetic innovation? And, we understand the consumers in charge here, and that the packers are in charge, and that the food service and retail are in charge. And we believe that market acceptance for our gene edit, it begins with creating shared value. Not just creating the shared value, but being able to communicate its holistic benefits up and down the value chain. And so I know I'm tight on time, and so I'm going to go through some of these slides pretty quickly. But our quadruple bottom line focuses on being able to clarify and share the benefit across people, pigs, planet, and then also profitability. And so for people, we understand that the benefits provide safe, secure, and affordable food supply. There are environmental benefits. There's improved animal health and welfare, which the consumer is becoming increasingly concerned about. There's less physical labor, emotional demands on the folks that are running our farms that don't have to deal with as many sick pigs. Also, we're just making farms more sustainable, which again, the consumer is starting to ask more questions about. The implications for the pigs are even stronger. Improved disease resistance, resilience, and vitality. We're literally removing a devastating disease. Improved health and welfare, reduced risk of secondary infection, and because of that, less need for antibiotic use. And this reduces morbidity and mortality. For the planet, more efficient feeding reduces GHG emissions. You actually need less feed, you need less water. We are doing more with less manure production. And this supports the corporate goals that we've talked about earlier today. Then also on profitability, that's a very important part of sustainability, is that you need to have a profitable business to actually make any changes, and to actually have a sustainable business, it must be profitable. And so we understand that by making a business more profitable through our gene edit, it improves feed efficiency, it lowers production costs, it reduces overall input costs, and it helps farmers be more profitable. But again, we understand that the consumer is in charge. The consumer gets to make this decision, and they need to understand how important this is for the things that they care about, and some of the things that they may not even be aware of. And so we've invested in some significant research, and PIC's got great partnerships, and I'm proud to share these Iowa State University research investments that we've made. We're working with Dr. Daryl Holtkamp to better understand the economic impact of the PRRS virus. Of course, Dr. Holtkamp has been a leader in this research for quite some time. We're working with Dr. Daniel Linares and Dr. Isadora Machado from the veterinary school at ISU to understand how much the PRRS-resistant pig can reduce the need for antibiotic use. Of course, it's a virus, but that virus weakens the immune system and causes a significant amount of secondary infections. We're also working with Dr. Greg Toma on our life cycle assessment, which we talked about significantly today. Dr. Toma is among the world's leading LCA modelers, especially in agriculture, and he's completed LCAs for the likes of pork, dairy, beef, other types of commodities. And we're really grateful to have him help us understand the environmental impacts of our genetics and our gene edit. And then also, when we talk about the consumer, it's really important that we understand where they are. How does the consumer feel about gene editing? How do they feel about it in animal protein? And what are some of the questions and concerns that they have? And so just recently, we actually kicked off a full-on consumer insights campaign. We're building out a consumer research engine, and we're working with a very well-known and established group called Circana to help us do that. But I did want to share some of our old research. We will be able to update these in the coming months, but this is from some sessions in 2021. Overall, the consumer has 30% awareness of gene editing. I think on our new research, we'll see this number go up a little bit. 45% are comfortable with gene editing. And then here's the big one, 80% are neutral or comfortable with gene editing. And so really there's a lot of people that are in that movable middle that are trying to figure out what this means and how they feel about it. I'm excited to see what our new round of research shows. I think that since COVID and since we've seen technology help out the human space, I think that we're starting to see these numbers become even more favorable. But generally, what's the consumer saying? They're wanting to know what's in it for them. Like I still see this as a quote from some of our focus groups in 2018. I still see this as more of a benefit for the breeders and food producers and less of an advantage for consumers. Is this really going to help out society? Are we going to get better? Are we going to be healthier? What is this really going to do? And so we need to make sure that we communicate these holistic benefits, that we are making sure that we are understanding from a credible and a holistic base with these other research investments that we've made, so that the consumer understands exactly what this means to them. This isn't just a production benefit. This benefits society, and we're going to be able to demonstrate that. So finally, in closing, I'm going to talk about the 4 critical roles of genetic improvements. Genetic improvements address problems and reduce impacts before they occur. We're able to mitigate emissions, not sequester them later. This preempts problems and creates solutions that benefit producers and then overall society. Again, and I think this one cannot be understated, is raising the right animal is critical to the sustainability of protein production. Why we see some of the other things that we're going to need to do, like cover crops, like no-till, those have regional implications. You can't raise cover crops in every single geography, but a more efficient animal, a robust animal, that has benefits whether or not you're raising pigs in the desert or you're raising them right next to the feed that they're being fed right next to them. So healthy, robust pigs are more profitable and they reduce environmental impact. PIC, we've got a 60-year track record of improving animal genetics that lead to healthier and more robust and efficient animals. And now we're committed to leveraging those generations and our knowledge to make the pork industry even stronger. And that legacy continues today with us being able to roll out our PRRS gene edit. We believe that gene editing is a part of the future of animal health and human health, and delivering value and supporting advancements across the entire and full value and production chain. So finally, I did want to just share a little bit of an update. I know I'll probably get a question on this, but our U.S. regulatory approval, I'm happy to say that we did recently update our guidance to investors publicly on May 16th of this year. We originally were going to submit our final FDA packet by the end of 2024, and now we're planning on doing that this summer. And so we're really excited about that and helping to bring this revolutionary and impactful and beneficial technology to market. So I apologize for not being able to be there in person. It was certainly my intention, and I hope that this presentation was worthwhile for you. This is my email and my contact information. I honestly would like to hear from any of you on any feedback, questions, concerns, or guidance that you might have. But I will stop there and see if anybody in the audience has any questions.
All right, thank you, Banks. Got time for a couple questions from the audience. We're scanning the audience right now. All right, I'll ask the first one. When do you think, Banks, based on where your current progress is, that we will see a gene-edited pork chop on a plate in a restaurant? When you're looking in your crystal ball.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say that it's a black ball right now. There are so many things that are in movement. Of course, pork production and pork export is a global business, and so we're working on regulatory approval across other major pork production and import markets. And so we're still working on trying to figure out exactly what that timeline may look like. And so there is a difference between FDA approval and an actual commercialization. This is much different than a pharmaceutical product where, once you get approval, it can be within the system within a year. These are animals, these are breeding animals, and it takes time to disseminate those out. And so there's a lot of things at play, and we're trying to figure out exactly what that means. And it could very well look different for different markets across the globe.
Sure. Any other questions from the audience? Oh, we got one in the back there. If somebody wants to hustle a microphone, give us just a second, Banks.
So, Banks, with some of the calculators that we have available to the industry out there, if we increase growth rate or increase throughput by reducing death loss, we actually get more carbon output. And that's sensical, I guess. But where do you see that going in the future? Are we going to be able to recognize benefits in carbon use by increasing throughput? And who are the folks that we need to be looking for to have an impact on LCA and how we figure it, and et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we're really lucky to have Dr. Greg Toma on our LCA, and honestly, as pork producers, you're lucky to have the National Pork Board that have made that investment in that framework. is because we are now going to be able to express those production efficiencies that a producer benefits from in terms of a carbon benefit. And so through that, we are actually going to generate a carbon asset through more efficient production, through the use of elite genetics. And we're going to show that corporations can then claim that as a GHG reduction in their supply chain. And so I think what you are seeing on kind of some of the death loss is that you're seeing a lot of waste, right? You're taking resources and you're wasting them, and they don't actually put anything out into the market. And so when you're able to remove disease or make animals simply just more efficient, you're able to mitigate those losses, and you're making the system more efficient. And so I believe as we start being able to actually show that this framework works, and that downstream corporations that buy our products, our customers and our customers' customers, as they start understanding that benefit, I think that they're going to start rewarding producers for being more efficient. And I think that the work that Pork Board's supporting and our LCA will be able to defend that in a credible way in the United States and then in other markets around the globe as well.
All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Banks.